Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 19 Historians Podcast. Today, I, your humble narrator, will be speaking to the equally humble but much more charming Daeres, who is a longtime moderator of Ask Historians and someone who is one of our early users who came in with just huge amounts of knowledge and class that joined up early in Ask Historians history. So I'm very happy to have him on. When I asked him to pick a topic that he wanted to speak on, I thought that he would go with what he's better known for, which is talking about the Greek colonies in Bactria post Alexander the Great and things like, Greeks who convert to Buddhism and things like that. But no, he picked something that apparently which is kind of close and near and dear to his heart, which is the Assyrian State Archives, which is a collection of cuneiform documents the documents document a bunch of cuneiform documents covering all manner of topics and really giving us tremendous insight into the Neo-Assyrian state and not only the state but daily life at the time as well. So it's a very fascinating topic that he went through. I didn't have much knowledge of it at the time, and I was just kind of rapt. He picked out a few of the documents, and I will put links to them, or actually I'll put links to the online site where you can look at the Assyrian state documents and put the document codes in there, because it's a little Web 1.0, and it has. I'll just go ahead and warn you. It has frames, so just keep that in mind. Couple show notes. We do have a couple of unfortunate technical peccadillos in this one. There's some clicks and Daeres fades in and out, and at one point we actually lost our connection. See if you can actually figure out when that is. I tried to cover that up with clever editing the best I could. Other than that, it's also a bit longer than our usual episodes. We try to clock in about an hour plus. This one's about an hour 45 minutes. It was flowing so well that I didn't feel like chopping it into two parts as I would usually do. Also, it's preparing you for what will be the next two episodes of Ask Historians, which are going to be on the Byzantines, and which are by far our longest episodes each. They're downright Dan Carlin-esque in their length. So I hope you enjoy and you learn something about both the Assyrian State Archives, the documents, Assyria, the ancient Near East, and the fact that apparently British people don't use the word boonies. So enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I'm very happy to have fellow moderator Daeres, or as his parents and the world around him knows him, Rory. And today we will be talking about today we are talking about the Assyrian State Archives. So before we get started, Rory, could you give us a little bit about your educational background, because the Assyrian State Archives isn't exactly, I would expect, something that most children growing up right now are thinking, man, I really love reading the Assyrian State Archives. So how did you kind of get interested in this subject, and what have you done to kind of study it?
Well, first of all, I have to absolutely refute your baseless assertion that kids have no interest in reading obscure ancient documents from Assyria. That's just lies and slander. But to seriously answer your question, I first started getting interested in Assyria because I had access to the British Museum growing up, and the British Museum is one of the big centres, though I didn't know it at the time, for studying Assyria, and they have lots and lots of Assyrian artefacts displayed there. And then when I came to decide on the university subjects, I went for ancient history. Mostly, I must confess, because I've been getting bored of modern history. And having completed that in what was a Greece and Rome focused course, I decided to expand that to a master's degree. And my master's had a much expanded range of material that was available to study. And one of them was a course that was on the ancient Near East in the first millennium BC. And that is what gave me a genuine introduction into actually studying Assyria. And that's why this is what I'm talking to you about today.
So when we are talking about the Assyrian State Archives, what are we actually talking about then?
The State Archives specifically are a publication series of any and all documents from ancient Assyria that are considered to be archival. Specifically, it's from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and they are cuneiform documents on clay, rather than being ink documents on parchment, as you might initially think when hearing the word archive.
So I would guess there probably may have been parchment or other kind of, palm leaf or whatever kind of writings that just simply haven't survived. But what we have left is these kind of impressed clay tablets, which I think if anyone has seen or been even mildly cognizant of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, the kind of impressed clay with the kind of wedge-shaped cuneiform. So what are we actually talking about when we say cuneiform? Because I think a lot of people have heard the word, are slightly familiar with it, but don't really have a whole lot of deep knowledge of the subject.
The word cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, which is a word we inherited from the French and comes from a Latin term which same thing. It wasn't originally used to refer to any kind of written script. It was just a phrase that means wedge-shaped. But we now used it specifically to refer to a particular family of ancient scripts for writing. The original cuneiform pictograms were developed by the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. And the reason I say pictograms is that they were supposed to be a depiction of the actual concepts that were being rendered by all the characters. However, over time they became increasingly abstract, so that they no longer visually resembled any kind of picture whatsoever. And after that period, it became what we're more familiar with, where it was used to render syllables. They were never used for individual letters like an alphabet. It was always at least syllables, and oftentimes they were also used for what are called logograms and ideograms, which means that a single symbol is representing one concept rather than an actual written word. The Sumerians were the people who originally developed cuneiform, but it was adopted by nearly all of the people surrounding them in Mesopotamia and outside of them, and in particular, one of the people who adopted cuneiform was the Assyrians.
So is this a writing style that, of course, was used for multiple languages at the time, or was it associated with one language in particular?
It originally was specifically associated with Sumerian, but the relationship between the two things became obsolete after the script was specifically adapted to local languages. They would occasionally still use the same sounds as the original Sumerian cuneiform, but because they were for different languages, it obviously would not ultimately represent the same words, and sometimes they would use the symbols and then attach completely different sounds to the specific language. Assyrian and Akkadian cuneiform in general does that, and so does Hittite cuneiform, which I'm not talking about today.
But we will be talking about the Neo-Assyrians. So presumably there were some Paleo-Assyrians or Old Assyrians or pre-Assyrians. What time period are we talking about, and what kind of culture and civilization are we really talking about when we talk about Neo-Assyrians? So, to talk about this, I'll introduce the Assyrians in general, just in case anybody feels like they've heard the name and they've never really understood what it was supposed to refer to. The Assyrians specifically, and this is throughout all of the periods of their history, referred to a people who lived in the north of what's now modern Iraq. The region of Mesopotamia traditionally was divided into two halves. Assyria was the northern half and Babylonia was the southern half. Both of them spoke Akkadian languages. Akkadian is a Semitic language like Hebrew and Aramaic, in fact, but there are no speakers left of it today and nobody writes in it either. Assyria as a state is traditionally founded somewhere around 2050 BC, and the reason for that particular date is because that is when allegedly the Temple of Ashur was founded, which was the heart of the kingship of Assyria. Originally, it was just one city-state, which we also call Ashur because it was named after the deity in question, or the deity is named after the city. That is the Old Assyrian period, which lasts from around 2050 BC to a more specific date of 1392 BC, which begins what's known as the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. And this is where Assyria is no longer more like a city-state with an extended
merchant presence in other places. It becomes a large territorial power alongside big heavyweights of the period like the New Kingdom of Egypt and Babylon and the Hittites. That lasts until what is known as the Bronze Age collapse, which of course sounds like a bumper fun period for the Assyrians, but the period we're talking about is the Neo-Assyrian period, as you mentioned. That is said to begin in 911 BC, because that is the time in which the traditional boundaries of Assyria were completely reconquered. And then after that, all of the military campaigns conducted by Assyrian kings were conquering what was considered by them new territory that was not their traditional claims. And this Neo-Assyrian period is what we're focused on. And just as a general explanation of what we're dealing with here, it's sometimes considered to be the world's first true imperial. That's sometimes argued, but it is certainly the one that has sufficient evidence to call it an imperial state. And at the time in which we're dealing with the state archives, Assyria was probably the single most large and powerful military state in the world.
So when we say something is an imperial state, what is our working definition of that? Because I've often heard that claim before, that Assyria was the first empire.
That's a very good question. There are, unfortunately, a lot of arguments as to what imperial and empire refers to, especially because in English, many of our conceptions, and indeed the language about empire, specifically derive from Rome, which provides this classical image of what an empire should look like to most of the English-speaking world, and indeed much of the European countries as well. In my case, my operating definition of empire tends to involve a situation in which one state, with its own rulers, whatever form those rulers take, is overruled over another, whether that be by military domination or whether that be by treaty, and they are still considered two separate entities, but one of them clearly exerts, if not complete control, then dominance over the others. So this is a little bit jargony for my taste, but the way I refer to empires is often as a meta-state, which means that rather than being a type of state, it's a form of collecting them together, but specifically under the dominion of a particular area, region, ruling class, or sometimes, in the cases like ancient Athens, it's an actual entire population.
To go back to what you said about one state exerting control or force over another, how exactly were the Neo-Assyrians doing this? I'm glad you brought up the fact that our conceptions, particularly in the Western, America and the Western Europe kind of sphere of thought, are really influenced by Rome, where we think there's kind of this formal process of, having provinces with governors, everyone becomes Roman. Was that the case with the Neo-Assyrians? Were they sending out governors and displacing local rulers, or were they kind of more doing I guess what from my own experience would be called like a hegemonic empire, where it's you keep your local rulers but you acknowledge the greater power of the Assyrians? Was everyone expected to become an Assyrian, or was it kind of keeping local cultures in place? How did the Assyrian Empire kind of work in that sense?
Initially, the Assyrians drew a very direct contrast between the two segments of what they ruled over. First was the kingdom of Ashur, or Assur, depending on how you want to run the pronunciation, which was the specific area of Assyria. And then the other half of that equation was what they referred to as the yoke of Ashur, which in this case meant places that were not part of Assyria that nonetheless were being led by the Assyrians in their foreign policy. Initially, it would have been what you described briefly there as hectoring, where they would have not sent out direct governors, but they would have instead relied on client kingdoms, where they had an installed friendly ruler or dependent ruler or ruling class that would rule the province essentially as an extension of Assyrian foreign policy, but in terms of internal affairs would be left fully autonomous, with the one exception that the Assyrians would demand tribute from them. However, as the Neo-Assyrian Empire wound on, rebellions by various client states became more of a consistent problem, especially after the empire became increasingly large. As we see the Neo-Assyrian period winding on, the increase is generally that of Assyria itself being expanded to encompass much larger areas than before, which were directly ruled by governors appointed by the Assyrian kings and were no longer being ruled by client states. It was never a state in which everything was ruled by a governor. There were always areas with some client king of one kind or another, but the proportion of the state that was ruled by client kings was increasingly small. However, despite the fact that increasingly large areas were directly governed by Assyrian appointed officials, they wouldn't have tried to assume that everybody within the empire was Assyrian. Even in the very last Assyrian documentation, it is very clear that they still considered Babylonians and Canaanites and Egyptians and Hittites, where relevant, to all be entirely separate peoples from the Assyrians. It was explicitly a multinational empire.
And on the more local level, are we talking, when we talk about the Neo-Assyrians, are we still talking about, large ziggurats and, vineyards and slaves and an elite class of, priestly people and nobility as well, with sharp class divisions? What does the actual society look like at this time?
At this time, there are everything that had been traditional divisions within the Assyrian sphere is incorporated into the imperial bureaucracy and leadership in general, so that you are still very much getting these upper class priests and military officials and governors and members of the royal family and landowners, all of which are considered vitally important components of the empire rather than merely social components of Assyria. Slavery would definitely have still been practiced within Assyria itself, and as far as I'm aware, it would also have still been practiced in all of the areas that they claimed as part of the empire. They didn't introduce the practice of slavery, but they had no problem with the practice either. There are many, many documents from this era of various different parts of their empire, which are contracts for the purchase of slaves, which are auctions of slaves, which are slaves being purchased with land attached to it and such things. So there are definitely stark class divides within the Assyrian Empire as a whole. All the ones that I just talked about are generally within Assyria itself. They also try to incorporate, where possible, the traditional upper classes of the individual components of the empire and the traditional intelligentsia of their empire as well. So that, where possible, they would try to use, say, Egyptians, or in some cases Arabs or Canaanites as governors where possible. And even in areas with a direct Assyrian governor, they would still be reliant upon the various military elites for providing manpower for their army, because Near Eastern states throughout that entire period generally had this thing where they would conquer a state and the entire armed forces of that state would then get added to their own. It's like Mega Man or It's like it's continually enlarging semi-professional army made up of all different bits of the empire.
Gotcha.
And when I mentioned intelligentsia, the Assyrian court was very notable for gathering what at that time was considered the intellectuals of all of the different parts of their empire together. So Egyptian scribes, priests, and oracles, and any other kind of mystical intellectuals they could find were gathered there. The same with ones from Syria, and basically anywhere in the empire where there was a tradition of knowledge, be that religious or what we would term the Assyrians would gather them together around to provide him with the best information that he could receive.
So basically, just to return to one thing you said there, your working definition of imperialism then would be that it's much like Mega Man.
I don't see any problem with that definition, no.
But I would also assume that a lot of this information that we've been covering here comes from these state archives, these collection of documents. So why don't we really talk a little bit about what's actually in the archives? What kind of documents do we have that have been preserved up to this time?
Absolutely. So there's a number of different genres of documents that are represented in these archives. As I mentioned earlier, the archives themselves are published by modern publications in volumes, so it's modern editors deciding how to group these texts together potentially, and how they generally do that is to group them by the type of content and the genre of the document in the first place. So for my first example of what an actual state archive of Assyria tablet looks like, this is a personal letter sent by the king, specifically King Sargon II, to one of his deputies, who is from the letter quite clearly somewhere on the border with what we consider to be Turkey now. And this genre that I'm illustrating here that we have access to is one that is an incredibly rare resource for any archivist, no matter what the period, in that it is to be private correspondence between the king of Assyria and one of his specific servants, so that there is no consideration put into this letter for an audience or for trying to present the king in a particularly good light beyond the social niceties. So what we have is essentially a relatively unrestricted view of a specific thought and a set of expressions and orders that a king was actually giving to his dependents. And I wanted to illustrate that with a quote, or series of quotes. This letter specifically is dealing with the fact that a number of states in what is now Turkey have essentially come over to the Assyrian side. The king's servant has sent him a previous letter telling him about all of this, and the king is reacting to the news. And his reaction to the news is, and I'm quoting directly now, "This is extremely good. My gods Ashur, Shamash, Bel, and Nabu have now taken action, and without a battle or anything, the Phrygian has given us his word and become our ally." The translator has given exclamation marks to a couple of those sentences because the words used in this and the form of the way that the words have been given their additional tones indicates the king is extremely pleased with this turn of events.
Yeah, so I assume with cuneiform we don't have exclamation points or a great deal of punctuation, so there must be a lot of context clues you have to draw upon.
Absolutely. That's actually something I should have said earlier, and thank you for pointing that out. Cuneiform itself does not, in fact, possess anything that we would recognize as punctuation. There are contextual pieces of information that can be used to determine when and where sentences begin, but this is often extremely difficult. And when you look at a transcribed piece of cuneiform, it just looks like a mass of syllables without any kind of punctuation whatsoever. So absolutely, there are no exclamation marks in the text I'm actually quoting from. Those are added to give additional context for modern readers.
And you said that this was a missive sent to an official on what is now kind of the Turkish-Iraqi border. So how do we have this document? Where do we actually find some of these? Do we have caches of documents that have been found? Do we have individual pieces that have been excavated? Do we know much about this one in particular?
This document in particular was excavated, and the vast majority of cuneiform documents are ones that have been excavated. This one in particular comes from the city of what was called Kalhu, or Kalu, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and that was discovered quite some time ago because we had initially cuneiform before it could be translated, so that in many cases, many of these documents have actually been rattling around in various museums and archives for a surprisingly large amount of time before they were translated. And yes, they are almost all taken from specific archaeological digs of cities where we tend to find archives. But whilst this document is not from one of what I'm about to refer to, there are also private archives that belong to private citizens, if you will, not people like the king, but individual families who possess archives of important documents and the source for documents, not from this genre, but of documents in general.
So before we move on to some of the other letters, I have just one or two more questions about this one. So you did remark that these kind of Turkish groups, or these kind of northern Iraq, southern Turkey, kind of the upper arc of the Fertile Crescent, I guess you could say, were coming over to the Assyrian side. So what was bringing them into that fold? Was it kind of joined up now under your own terms, or joined up now under our terms later, or was there a common threat? What was the impetus, if we know, at this time?
This particular document mentions the fact that with the letter came several political prisoners, which indicates that these are people whom the Assyrians considered to be essentially fugitives. 14 of them in particular, who were returned to the Assyrians by the people who had just come over as their allies. That indicates that in general this is a diplomatic overture, and not one that had been initially expected, because the excitement at not having to fight a battle over the issue was so very palpable in the letter. Larger reasons for this is probably because in this period, genuine international rival Urartu had essentially been humiliated by a series of military losses to the Assyrians, and also to what is essentially the prototype horse nomad invasion of the Cimmerians. And so people who had been traditionally allied to Urartu now no longer had a big friendly daddy to cuddle up to whenever something threatening was going on, and the only alternative left would have been Assyria.
Now, there's also a mention of, and I'll probably screw this pronunciation up because I'm, sadly, I am not up on my, ancient Mesopotamian pronunciations, but Urpala'a, and it seems like it's referenced as sort of an Assyrian ally who's had cities taken, and is considering it, from what I read, to perhaps be leaving the Assyrian fold.
Yes, you've read the context completely correctly there. Upala, and that's me trying to get the glottal stop in there, which is a really awkward thing for English speakers to pronounce, is clearly a dependent of some kind of Assyria. From context, that could well refer to a dynasty, a particular ruling king, a city, or it could refer to the proper name of a particular small kingdom. And absolutely, this is a very common thing to happen to any of the large kingdoms of this era. They would have these collections of small dependents between them and people who they considered to be enemies, and they would often compete with one another for influence among them. But what would often happen is, because they were not explicitly part of these empires, these little puppet states would war with one another, and if they were not properly protected, they would often go in a huff and decide that this person who is officially my protector is insufficient. In many cases, they would then seek an alternate patron, but in this particular case, where there is no large patron but Assyria, they're talking about the possibility that it will actually go it alone completely and essentially move away from Assyrian control. And as the lower in the paragraph, the king has a response to this, in which he says that this doesn't matter. He specifically says, now that the Phrygian has made peace with us, what can all the kings of Tabal do henceforth, Tabal being the region that this Urpala belongs to? He clearly thinks that now that the Phrygians have come over to the Assyrian side, this actually doesn't concern him too much. Where could this recalcitrant puppet state possibly turn to for a new patron. So what he just says is that you will press them from this side and the Phrygian from that side, so that in no time you will snap your belt on them. There's all of this kind of sort of imagery to do with this dependent. This is not the king himself. He's actually saying to his servant to make these fully independent kings basically bow down to him. And in fact, there's this phrase later in the letter, in which he says, "Let him come," referring to a messenger. "Let him come, and let Ashur, Shamash, Bel, and Nabu, all of which are Assyrian gods, command that all these kings should wipe your sandals with their beards," which is my favourite bit of the whole letter, because it's just such irreverent imagery to be talking about these full independent kings. And it's also quite a funny image, because they really like their beards at that period.
So actually, to return back to what you were saying about this Urpalach, I'm not going to get the glottal stop anyway. Being perhaps a dynasty, perhaps an area. How much do we actually? Because I mean, there's a lot of proper names and nouns and places and people who are mentioned in these letters. How much do we actually know about where and what kind of people are being referenced in these letters? So do we know where Urpala was? Do we know where the Atuninaeans and Ustuadaeans are? Or the cities of Bitparuta? Do we this? It's a very big mess of these proper nouns. So how much do we know about where these things actually were?
That is a perfectly fair question. The sheer quantity of Assyrian documentation is an aid here, because if a given place or a proper name of any kind is only mentioned in the one document, then absolutely it becomes a real task trying to guess from contextual clues what they could possibly be referring to. But if something is referred to in 10 different cuneiform documents or 100 cuneiform documents, then they will inevitably be referring to specific things that will enable it to more clearly be one thing or the other. When it comes to trying to locate places, for example, if somewhere is mentioned on a campaign, because there are cuneiform documents that talk about campaign itineraries, or it talks about a region and locates things relative to one another, the absolute bonanza is if we find documents from a local area that clearly establishes that place as possessing a name that we can also evidence from other documents. So, for example, if Urpala was actually found on the name of several documents from a city that seemed likely to be a candidate, then that would definitively establish the location of it. As it is, unfortunately, that's not possible for everything. This letter and others at least establishes the region in which places like Urpala exist in, because we can locate it near to known locations. But there is often some reconstruction involved when it comes to maps, and there is often quite a lot of guesswork that comes on. We can, if we're dealing with, say, a Western European or Northern European analogy, we can at least talk about somewhere being within California or Texas or Scotland, but what we can't necessarily pin down is that we're talking about Houston or San Diego or Aberdeen, because we don't necessarily know where all three of those cities would be in this analogy.
And so who is actually writing these letters then? And you might want to, we could possibly segue into another letter here, which is titled, "I Have No Scribe." Because
I see what you did there. That was particularly cunning segue. Yes, indeed.
Because there is a bunch of kind of the beard wiping of the sandals. There's some very distinctive and flowery language. So would the king actually be writing these themselves? Would there's a dedicated class of scribes?
The answer is potentially both. The reason I say that is because it is absolutely certain that there was a professional cadre of scribes that existed throughout the Assyrian state, and this is true for any of the cuneiform utilizing states so far as we're aware. There would have been a professional category of scribe, and for an empire as large, bureaucratic and complex as the Assyrians, there was a great many of them. This is not a small bureaucracy in the slightest, and these scribes would have been trained for years in order to be able to use cuneiform, because its inventory of particular letters and glyphs is so large, and because they are not like an alphabet and a direct one-to-one relationship with audible sounds, they are much more complicated to learn, and it would clearly have taken years for anyone to master the use of cuneiform, which is why the rare cuneiform tablets we have illustrating people learning how to write it are so very valuable for gaining an insight into that process. However, I did also mention it was possible that kings themselves could write cuneiform, and the reason that I mention this is because, first of all, there are many attestations of King Ashurbanipal, who is one of the last kings of Assyria, as being personally fluent in several languages, but also being literate in several languages. Many cuneiform documents attest to that, and there are some that may have been personally authored by him. Secondly, the document that I'm about to talk about illustrates where somebody who is not a scribe still possesses a basic literacy that enables them to write a letter. Now, it's a very short letter, so I can actually quote the entire thing. There's an introduction that I'll include, but this isn't the main focus of the letter. To the king, my lord, your servant Sin Nadi, good health to the king, my lord. And that is your basic butt-kissing introduction if you are lower to the king. And the content of his letter is very simple. I have no scribe where the king sent me to. Let the king direct either the governor of Arapa or Ashubelutakin, who is presumably some kind of official, to send me a scribe, and that's it. And an important note about this letter is it was not initially understood properly because there are spelling mistakes and errors with the glyphs that meant that when people were trying to read it, they were reading really esoteric content from it until somebody realized from enough contextual clues this is somebody who cannot write cuneiform to the same standard as a scribe. However, and referring to what you were asking me, this is still somebody who is not a scribe. They quite clearly identify themselves as not being a scribe, but nonetheless they possess sufficient ability with the cuneiform letter to render a passable document that requested that a scribe be sent. And this is actually one of the most important letters in the many thousands that exist in the state archives of Assyria, because it illustrates that literacy is much wider among the elites of the Assyrian Empire than we had previously understood.
Now, so if elites at least had a passing workable knowledge of being able to write cuneiform, do we have any evidence or have any knowledge of how much this would extend to the common classes, or is it more of kind of a professional elite class that was using cuneiform?
This is unfortunately not as well understood as we would like, because the documents of cuneiform that overwhelmingly survive tend to be monumental inscriptions or clay tablets that have some kind of direct official purpose, which means that the equivalent of graffiti is actually harder to find at times than it is for things like ancient Greek and Roman, and partly that is to do with the age rather than any inherent quality, but it also it's to do with the preservation of buildings. Because graffiti is so commonly written on buildings, this means that when you're dealing with foundation levels of buildings and nothing higher than that, you are incredibly unlikely to have anything like that survive on the side of it, which is why, incidentally, Pompeii and Herculaneum within archaeology as a whole is so unusual, because there are so many standing walls and even upper stories of buildings. In the archaeology of Assyria, that would essentially be improbable. To directly answer your question then, it is not known for certain exactly how widespread illiteracy was. Documents like this hint at wider literacy than we traditionally understood, but do not, unfortunately, give us anything like a demographic or a percentage that we can roughly estimate it. In the balance of probability, it's likely that ordinary Assyrians could not, in fact, read and write cuneiform, and it is certainly the case that the majority of the subjects of the Assyrian king in the empire would not have been able to read cuneiform in any form.
To return to the content of the letter, short as it is, one sentence that did jump out at me was the "I have no scribe where the king sent me to," which seems like a bit of tortured grammar there. And you did mention that there was misspellings, but do we have a sort of grammatical knowledge of cuneiform as well? And is this kind of an example of it?
Yes, this is not an example of grammatical cuneiform, because the translator there, quite skillfully, has tried to illustrate that there is awkward, clunky grammar in the sentence. Obviously, Akkadian grammar does not in any way correspond to English grammar, so the translator has tried to use an equivalent form of awkward but understandable phrasing to illustrate the fact that this is not an incredibly clearly written letter. As for do we understand Akkadian grammar, we understand most elements of Akkadian grammar, mostly because it has a number of relatives as languages that mean that there's a much greater body of things to compare it to, and therefore potentially to reconstruct missing elements for. Because Akkadian is a Semitic language, it means that it can be at the very least compared to modern Hebrew, to Arabic, and to Neo-Aramaic, which is spoken by very few people who identify as Assyrians and Chaldeans. And there are also ancient Semitic languages like Canaanite, which can also be known as Phoenician, depending on context, and the specific Carthaginian variant of that. There's a language known as Ugaritic, Eblaite, and these are very obscure languages, which I'm not going to explain in any depth, but the summary of what I'm saying is, because there are so many evidenced Semitic languages from different parts of history, it means that reconstructing the overall grammar of Akkadian is not quite as difficult as it would be if we only had Akkadian to work with.
You also mentioned that there had been previous, more esoteric interpretations of this document, simply because of the difficulty in interpreting it. Were there any particularly notable or long-lasting or widely accepted interpretation of this document before someone realized, oh, this person is just not very good at writing?
Fortunately, the misinterpretation of the document did not last particularly long. The reason for this is because the process of translating documents for the first time is very lengthy when you have millions of tablets available. Therefore, because the new documents are only added very slowly, people can react to them very quickly in academia. And from my readings, it was within a very short year span that another expert looked at the tablet, looked at the interpretation that had been given of it, and thought that it was completely bunk, and wrote a positional paper explaining why, and then went into more depth later on, and that it became the accepted interpretation of it. The original interpretation of it I do not have to hand, because they don't like to produce those in the up-to-date catalogues, precisely because they don't want anybody unintentionally using the older meaning of it. But I do remember it involved something really unusual involving oracles, and considered the content of the letter is literally just asking for a scribe. It's pretty clear that the spelling mistakes really threw the original translator for a loop.
So, in addition to kind of the textual evidence of this being someone with poor or minimal literacy, such as the spelling errors, do we also have, because cuneiform is impressed into clay tablets, do we actually have physical clues? Perhaps the impressions being somewhat sloppily made as well.
When I read, because I'm using the online archive for the text, but when I read the paper that detailed the actual understanding that this was a tablet that was done by mistake. I was initially presented with detailed information as to precisely how the characters were badly written or unclearly written. Now, I am fortunately, whilst I am a historian, I don't tend to focus on philology and on paleography, which refers to the study of handwriting, which means that I personally don't have an expert level of knowledge as to explain bad handwriting. But absolutely there were clues that this was poor handwriting, if you will, which multiple experts have since commented on. So absolutely, in addition to spelling mistakes, it is literally badly written.
So I want to move on to some of the other letters you suggest that we should look into, particularly some of the ones dealing with more kind of mundane interactions and transactions of business and commerce. But before we do that, I think now would be a good kind of time to really ask, when are these translations being made? Because it seems like we might have had these documents, because Mesopotamian archaeology has been going on for quite some time. So when are we discovering these leftover clay tablets, and when are the translations really being done? Presumably there's still a backlog that's being translated, but is there a main time period when many of these translations were done?
So, cuneiform, in terms of a script that was understood by people, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, the last cuneiform document that has been identified is from around 300 AD, and it is about one of the only cuneiform documents from that period, so it's pretty clear that it was all on its last legs by that period. So from about 300 AD onwards, cuneiform is no longer a language because nobody can read the Akkadian, and a script because nobody can read the cuneiform that anybody could any longer understand. There were still Assyrians kicking around after that point who identified as Assyrian, but they were no longer able to read it, and neither was anybody else who lived in the immediate area. So for a period of at least 1500 years or so, cuneiform documents were completely forgotten about. It was forgotten about as a language, it was forgotten about as a script, and nobody could read it. However, what people would then use instead as a source for Assyria for a great deal of time was the Bible, because unfortunately the kingdoms of Israel and Judea had the misfortune of being in the rough neighborhood that was the borders of the Assyrian Empire, and one of them was conquered and the other one was besieged, and thus the Old Testament talks several times about how horrible the Assyrians are, and this formed the primary basis of conversations in history about the Assyrians. However, I believe somewhere around the 16th century, we start getting reports from various European travelers in the Middle East that they're occasionally running into these inscriptions or documents written in an unusual script that they cannot read. There are a number of scripts that this could possibly be, but the sheer number of cuneiform inscriptions that survive means that in the balance of probability it is quite likely that what these travellers were encountering were still visible cuneiform inscriptions on canyon walls or on the sides of mountains, or even in some cases on the basis of statues, possibly. So there was very slowly a growing awareness that there were these ancient scripts that nobody could understand kicking about in the Middle East. The 18th century is when serious excavation work began as an entire occupation. The 18th century is when we get the first serious attempts to excavate Pompeii and Herculaneum, incredibly clumsy though those excavations were. The very first attempts to start acquiring antiquities from Egypt, though it wasn't quite in the same craze as before, and some of the very first tentative attempts to start exploring the archaeology, what is often termed the ancient Near East, but what we would generally refer to these days. And as this grew and grew as an interest, the entire archaeological field started to be born, where rather than people acquiring antiquities from various markets, it is people conducting serious excavation work in urban environments outside of Europe. And so by the middle of the 19th century, they'd excavated a number of cities that were named in the Bible and had discovered these caches of cuneiform documents. And people had tried to decipher them pretty much as soon as they'd uncovered them in the early 19th century, but this had not actually gone particularly well. However, there is a particular inscription in modern Iran called the Behistun inscription, or occasionally the Besitun inscription, because unfortunately there's more than one name for it, and it is a inscription that has 4 different scripts utilized on it, which means that if you understand one of them, you can then at least understand the content of the others and start to use it as a tool to decipher the script as a whole. And in this particular case, the language that was first deciphered was Old Persian, and the reason for this is because there was sufficient data to actually try and look at what it was actually saying, and then to try and expand on the previously understood knowledge of it. And fortunately for Assyriologists, one of the other inscriptions that was contained within this wider Behistun inscription was written in Akkadian, which meant that once they understood what all of these inscriptions were saying, that Behistun inscription could be used to start the process of trying to understand the Akkadian language and cuneiform scripts as a whole. And that was first seriously deciphered in the 1850s, which meant that from that period onwards there was a solid ground from which to try and decipher Akkadian language tablets. And from the 1860s onwards, it was accepted that Akkadian was an understood and known language. So to fully answer your question, from the 1860s onwards is when we could genuinely translate Akkadian cuneiform documents like the ones we've been talking about. The period from which the translations occurred, there is unfortunately no one period that they really all belong to, and arguably more translations are being done in the modern era because the number of Akkadian speakers in the modern world is very slowly growing. There are only a few hundred people in the world who can read cuneiform and read Akkadian cuneiform specifically, and there are hundreds of thousands of documents, which means that we only believe that maybe about a fifth of all extant cuneiform inscriptions and documents have so far been catalogued and translated properly. This is a very slow process, unfortunately.
I'd like to move on now to some of the more commercial and transactional writings that I referenced earlier, and these deal with an individual by the name of, and again I'm going to mispronounce this, Suma Ilani, who's doing various things like buying vineyards, houses, and slaves and such. So I think we're going to maybe take these as kind of as a group, but would you care to introduce these documents?
So, whilst not all of them deal with the guy that you mentioned, Suma Ilani, many of them do, and the reason I've grouped these documents together is that all of them are specifically records from the royal court at Nineveh. When I say the royal court, I'm not using that in the sense to mean the king and a big hall and a group of people sitting around. What I'm referring to is the other meaning of court, which refers to a legal jurisdiction in which various contracts were being signed. Many of these are much more, therefore, mundane than the 2 documents we've already dealt with. However, why I connected them to the earlier subject is because the people like Suma Ilani that you just mentioned are very much connected to the king, because these are, in many cases, his bureaucrats, his officials, and people close to him in general. Many of them are contracts that refer to the purchase of lands and slaves and lands with slaves. There's an awful lot of purchase of slaves that goes on. And why I'm bringing them up is because we so far talked about things that are connected to understanding the king and the Assyrian state's foreign policy, and indeed the internal structure of the Assyrian state. But for those listening who are more interested in social history, in learning about the methods by which people acquired land in Assyria and by the relative value that things were held by, and indeed the human cost of slavery, these documents will probably be infinitely more interesting. This very first letter, in which he signs with a fingernail rather than a seal, and that's something we'll probably come back to, purchasing 2 vineyards, which is clearly stated being 3 hectares worth of land in a particular city. With this comes a gardener, a palace farmer, 3 women, with one of them with a son, and that means that with the purchase of these 3 hectares and 2 vineyards come 7 people who are not listed as slaves, but nonetheless the ownership of these people is given to whoever owns this land. So if we're not talking about slaves, we are probably talking about tenant farmers, and in some cases servants, as this mentioned, because 2 of them are specifically named as being a gardener and a palace farmer, and in fact they're actually given names. Ashur Belutakin is a gardener, and Ahi Ime is a palace farmer. And it also lists the price that was paid for this amount of land and these 7 people, which is 25 minas of silver. To very briefly explain what this currency refers to, a mina is a fairly large unit of currency in the Middle Eastern world in this period. 1 shekel is the basic unit of currency, and a shekel is very much an ordinary coin. We're talking about a very small quantity. It's I'm trying to give you a weight here. It's only about 9 grams. So
of
it's
silver,
very
presumably, right?
Yes, in this case it's silver, but it can also be copper, bronze or gold, and the value of it varies depending on which material it is, and it is also occasionally used as a general measurement for metal regardless of being used as currency. So 1 shekel is a basic coin. It's not the same size as an ancient Greek drachma, but it has much the same function as being the general basic unit of currency that you most often see referred to, or say the ancient Roman sestertius, or things of that nature. 60 shekels makes up 1 mina. So when we're talking about this 25 minas of silver, that is a significant amount of money. That is, in terms of sheer weight, larger than a small dog in terms of the sheer weight of silver that is being exchanged for this land and for these 7 people. In addition to them paying money for it, there is also quite a lengthy bit. I will not lie, I'm not going to read this out in full because it is a very long bit of this document, but a large part of the contract is the dire threats as to what happens if the contract is broken, which involves gods, it involves lawsuits that you will inevitably lose, and quite significant fines for breaking it.
And there's also a bit about bringing, well, you bring minas of gold and place in the lap of a statue of a god, and then tie horses to the god statue. It struck me as kind of a strange, collision between what we'd recognize today as just kind of like a contract dispute clause in a legal document, paired up with some very, very literally archaic religious imagery and kind of mystical thinking about the world.
For the people in this period, and this doesn't just apply to the Assyrians, there is no separation of the religious from the secular, and culture in general from religion. Many serious legal documents were primarily backed by the force of the oath that was given to a god at a various points in it. Many other cultures like the ancient Greeks and many early Roman documents and many Phoenician documents, almost any ancient people for whom we have preserved documents will almost always invoke deities as a legal protection to do with the solemnness of the oath that is actually being given there, and they will often have some kind of religious component to the compensation. And the answer to your question is essentially this is not considered an unusual confluence for them, but it is for us, because it's very difficult for us in Western societies to generally imagine such esoteric, mystical elements being connected with purely forensic or legal. But for the Assyrians, there is absolutely no contradiction here. Gods are a force of law when invoked, just as much as giving your seal or fingernail is, and just as much as having witnesses to the document.
And actually, I did want to ask about that, because you are right. I want to go back to the question of using fingernails, because in the translation, it specifically mentions that fingernail impressions were used in place of seals. So clearly, Suma Alani had money. I believe it's mentioning he's a chariot driver, because
he is technically a chariot driver.
Yeah, so because he has at least a small dog's size worth of silver to be used in transactions. So was this kind of a way of kind of making your mark, I guess we would call it today, of people who are not?
Yes.
Yeah. So and the use of witnesses as well. So could you go more into that?
Absolutely. There is a variance between all of these contractual documents where some of them say that there is a seal on them. They will usually verbally announce, and there will also be a seal on top of it, but it's actually very useful because if for any reason the seal had been damaged, nonetheless the document would clearly say that a seal had been affixed. But in places of seals, many people instead utilize. They are consistently mentioned no matter whether you're a royal charioteer or whether you're a cook, as an alternate form of providing a kind of identifying mark. And the impression of the fingernail is a very unusual thing to use for our standards, because we would not consider fingernails to be a particularly good way of identifying somebody uniquely. However, given that there are also witnesses to these things and godly oaths, it is possible that that is by far not the most important aspect of the security guarantees of the document, and that the seal or fingernail is more of a formal element. As for why people didn't possess seals, generally speaking, you would possess a seal regarding your specific rank in the Assyrian state somewhere. Usually it's an official of some kind, and they would be hereditary for particular offices. So the Queen of Assyria, for example, had a particular seal. The individual interpretation of it would vary depending on which queen it was, but there would be a scorpion in it, because that was considered to be the symbol of the Queen of Assyria. The King of Assyria, likewise, though individual seals vary, the content of them always reflects that it is specifically the King of Assyria, and likewise, the Crown Prince of Assyria would have had his own particular seal as well. And the reason why this chariot driver likely does not possess a seal is that even though he is actually quite rich from his service in the king, he actually does not possess a significant rank in the grand scheme of things when it comes to ranking officials and members of the royal family. So he himself does not possess a formal rank beyond being a charioteer, but he also happens to be very rich as a result.
And to return to the question of witnesses, because I went through some of these documents with Suma Alani buying vineyards, buying a house, getting olive oil paid back to him, buying more land and more people. It doesn't seem like I first went through thinking like maybe there was a set group of people who he was using as witnesses for these transactions, because I did notice that some of them are also mentioned as being chariot drivers as well. So I figured, okay, rounded up some coworkers or something like that. So, but it didn't seem like these people were repeated. So how would they go about finding witnesses, and where would these transactions actually take place? You mentioned the royal court. So would these documents have to go kind of be witnessed in front of, I guess, what we call the equivalent today of like a public notary at the courthouse, or was there a less formal procedure? Yeah,
absolutely. The bit that you mentioned to do with being signed in front of a notary in a particular setting is absolutely the case, because if this was not created in the presence of a public notary, there is absolutely no reason why people could not fake documents to do with the witnesses, to do with what's been agreed, to do with any previous history that's referred to in the document. It's fairly clear that the scribe who is writing this is actually the one that belongs to the court, and not any of the people who are mentioned as important figures in documents that you mentioned, because I will very briefly mention the other Shumailani documents as well. But with this specific one, the scribe is indeed listed as a witness, or a scribe is listed as a witness, but it is very clear that the scribe themselves is doing this within the view of a public notary and is likely attached to the court itself. As for the process of rounding up the witnesses, it seemed fairly clear that there is no set procedure as to how to do that. You needed witnesses to get this thing done, and these were very functional things: handing over land, selling slaves, buying slaves. So given that these are not things in which you really want to have a very rigorous process, it's pretty likely that they would be rounding up whoever had decided to agree to be a witness. However, there is also a relative diversity among witnesses in terms of who they are. Taking the document that we started with, which is about him buying these 3 hectares in this vineyard, there is a horse raiser of the crown prince, an intelligence officer, a cohort commander of chariots, somebody with no listed profession, a palace chariot driver, a chariot fighter, and a scribe, all listed as professions of the various witnesses. So it's also clear that there's usually some diversity among the kind of persons who are used as witnesses, and what I cannot tell you is whether or not that is deliberate, or to do with the fact that a large amount of people would have been busy and in absolutely no place to spend however long it is waiting for a scribe to write up a document to go give the king his wine, or go to a swan from being trapped on the top of a city wall or something.
So I want to turn now to more of the actual content of the letters or these kind of archival documents and what they tell us about life at the time. Because of course, as you did mention, these are very important for kind of describing a social history of the Neo-Assyrians. So we do see this one individual, and I think there's some other documents that you want to reference, going through and just making daily purchases. Essentially, I mean they are large purchases as well, but how typical are these transactions, and how typical the things that are being bought and sold? So I know we've covered a little bit about slaves, or these kind of almost tenant farmers, or almost kind of serfs that seem tied to the land. But also there's one particular passage that struck me about when he buys a house, where it goes into everything that the house contains. He has a sleeping room, a bathroom, a servant's quarter, a main building, which is apparently 2/3 constructed, with an upper floor, a storehouse, and a wing with a tomb included. So, was this kind of a typical rich person's house, or what does this tell us about the time period?
In this period, it's very difficult to talk about any one typical design of house being a rich person's house, because rich people could exist in so many different areas of the empire and have no real relationship in terms of their style of architecture or their preferences for what a rich person should have. However, the size and wealth of the building, as indicated by the kind of things in it, are definitely typical of a house that is above average. The first thing that strikes you is it has an upper floor, which is not common in this period. Upper floors often collapse if they're not built properly, whereas a single-story house doesn't tend to have that problem. And so an upper story means there's additional maintenance, and the quality of the house needs to be absolutely ensured. There's a pre-built tomb in it, which you refer to, and is indeed a very striking element. It either means it's somebody's house which they recently departed from, and therefore the two may already have an occupant in it, or given the context, it's likely this is a newly built house that somebody has constructed on their own land and has sold to Shumet Lani, and it means that there is this pre-built house that already has a tomb built with it, an upper house in terms of an upper story, a storehouse, servants' quarters, and that alone is a huge giveaway to the fact that this is a very elite house within the context of Assyrian society as a whole. Even the fact that it has a bathroom as a specifically named room slightly indicates it as above the norm. It's also, given that this is a one house, it's 3 minas of silver, which is not anywhere near as huge as the 25 we mentioned earlier, but is still a significant amount of silver changing hands for what is a house, and is clearly somebody who does not lack for land, because we just saw him purchasing 3 hectares of land earlier. So if we're talking about how typical these transactions are, these are not typical transactions for ordinary Assyrians or people of ordinary means in this. We are very much looking at what royal service means in terms of your ability to purchase things equivalent to that of a very, very established rich member of society, where the social history for ordinary members of society comes in from these letters is when it talks about the slaves and servants and villages attached to various parcels of land that are being affected by it, where we can reasonably say that somebody who in theory is your landlord or owns the area that you live on one day decides to sell the land, and suddenly you are effectively sold with it as an ordinary family, and you have absolutely no decision in the matter regarding this, and you are now effectively owned by another. They happen to pay money for the right to do so.
And do we know if these individuals were tied to the land in a sense, or were they, despite having been sold with the land, were they free to up and move on if they had the means and ability to do so?
In some cases, it's fairly clear that they cannot move away from it. When slaves are specifically mentioned as coming with land, for example, it's clear they cannot move away from it. When it comes to things like it comes with a gardener or a palace farmer, as referred to earlier, these are always going to refer to people who are employed to stay there and do not possess great social power of their own, so it is very unlikely they would be able to move away from that either. It is definitely possible for people within families to move away from their traditional homes, however. It's definitely within the means of some ordinary Assyrians in this period to move house if they need to, but this often took the form of different members of the family radiating outwards where possible, so that you'd have a uncle who lived in a different part of Assyria, or even a nephew who happened to live in Babylonia, say. So you would essentially end up with the families, if they had the means to move outwards, radiating and not actually moving out of the original house, but instead creating these great networks of familial members across chunks of the Assyrian Empire. And this is often what a lot of merchant families seem to have eventually arisen out of, are families with sufficient means to spread themselves across a number of areas and therefore have this inbuilt network of communication.
And so just to ask about the general content of the state archives, because I know we've said that we have a huge cache of documents which have not been translated, and we have a huge, the 1/5 that have been. But is it generally more slanted towards these more elite purchases and elite missives to other elites, or do we have things like Farmer Jim Bob, or whatever the Akkadian equivalent of Jim Bob is, buying a goat from Farmer Bill?
The state archives of Assyria specifically very much skew to the elite, because if it's considered archival for Assyria, this generally means it has some kind of official place within the empire's own records. And for that to be the case, it generally involves somebody important in their conception of what important is. So within the letters of the State Archives of Assyria, it is incredibly skewed towards elite things. However, when talking about Assyrian cuneiform documents as a whole, that's not necessarily true. We're not talking about stuff outside of the State Archives of Assyria in terms of content today, but if you are more interested in learning about ordinary people and their contracts and their rations and their working rotas and such things, there are other collections of Assyrian documents that discuss these things. They tend to be more individually grouped than the state archives are, however, because they tend to be more difficult to group together, because either there are so many documents of the same kind or they're very individualized. So there are absolutely large collections of Assyrian documents that deal with Farmer Jim Bob, or in this case Farmer Jim Bob Usur, who will have his loans or his rations or his work rota or a building contract. But the state archives, if that's what you're interested in, generally only involve ordinary people as witnesses or as subjects of contracts and not the actual agent buying and purchasing. There are some exceptions to that, but the pattern is very much established that this is skewed towards the elite members of Assyrian society.
So we have one more letter from Suma Alani, our great protagonist here.
Yes.
Which refers to, and this is not him buying something, but this is him actually being owed something. So this is kind of another example of kind of the legalistic slant that these take. And it is, I believe it is 1,200 liters of oil being owed to him from apparently someone who is the major domo of Charchamesh. So who are these people? Because we know Sumalani is a chariot driver, so who's this major domo? And it also referenced people like the third official of the court or something like that. So what is the transaction going on here?
So this Ashur-Belusur, who you saw as the major domo of Carchemish. Carchemish is a city that is not actually in Assyria proper. It would have been a member originally of what's termed the Neo-Hittite states, which were the sort of leftovers of the Bronze Age Hittite groups, and Carchemish by this period was integrated into Assyria's administration, but it was not a traditional part of Assyria itself. So this is a city that is many hundreds of miles away from Nineveh, where this courthouse actually. So he is not doing this in his capacity as of Carchemish. He is doing this in his capacity of being present and being interacting with Shumu Ilani. It's possible that this quantity of olive oil was being dealt with sort of second hand, where the two men never physically met, but considering the seal of Ashur-Belusur is specifically invoked, it seems fairly likely that the man may actually have personally ventured to the royal court of Nineveh to actually have this contract done, or he may well have had somebody in his stead affix the seal to it who was considered to be his official representative. This is a very long distance loan. The distance between Carchemish and Nineveh I don't immediately have to hand, but it is quite some significant distance. In fact, I may quickly venture on a map to just give you a rough estimate. Yeah, Carchemish and Nineveh is several hundred miles away from one another. It would take probably, it may be even longer if things are very unkind to you, to reach Carchemish from Nineveh, and it's actually a huge quantity of olive oil, as you probably noticed.
1,200 liters is quite a bit, yes.
Oil.
And it does mention that if it's not delivered by a certain time period, then the quantity will double.
Absolutely. There was no kind of religious or social embarrassment about usury in this period. There is no restraint when it comes to having, say, if it's not repaid, there will be another double quantity of it that will be expected to be repaid. Not all of the usury payments that we see for loans are as extreme as that, but they are often something like 50% of the original value of the loan is expected to be returned with it. There's no social stigma with these very high officials charging one another interest for their various loans. But I suspect the reason why this loan has such a high interest and security if it's not repaid is the fact that this is such a huge quantity of oil that is being transferred across that it likely represents quite a significant portion of the profits from Shumu Ilami's various estates, because as we've already seen, he owns vineyards and other bits of farmland and villages, so this is likely the produce of his own land that he's loaning, and it's such an enormous quantity and enormously valuable that he absolutely, if this be he a major domo or not, if our friend Ashur Belasur does not repay it, he is going to want double what he got as compensation for the fact that he doesn't get the loan properly back in time.
Now, there was one actually textual element that I wanted to ask about as well, because the translator uses, when they're listing the witnesses, which of course there's multiple witnesses again, when they're listing the professions, at one point they just write ditto underneath someone, so presumably, having the same profession as above. So do we actually have a specific kind of cuneiform pictograph or icon or symbol that represents kind of like same as above, the way we might write, quotations underneath a list of things? Yes.
In fact, there is actually a specific character that is used to refer to ditto. It is one of the things that I mentioned earlier as being a logogram or an ideogram, where it is representing a concept rather than necessarily a spoken aloud word. And there is a specific logogram that actually refers to same as the above.
Excellent. And so there was a few other letters that I think you wanted to, or a few other documents that I think you might wanted to have referenced. So do you want to go ahead and bring those up?
Yes, if you give me a moment. Fortunately, the wonders of the Steam Age mean the internet is available, and I'm therefore not actually having to struggle to find these. Now, this is my final one that I want to do for Shumu Ilani, because it is an enormous contract. In this, we'd previously seen that he bought 3 hectares with the vineyards and the people. In this contract, which he is buying from one Bar Hate, he is buying 50 hectares of land, and it is specifically listed as possessing 10,000 vines in it and a built house. And not only does it have a built house, it has a man called Hashanah, his 4 sons and his wife, the woman donkey, her son and her daughter, a total of 9 persons who will be his servants rather than those of Bar Hate, who they had previously been servants of. And this is 50 hectares with 10,000 vines, was bought for 6 minas of silver rather than the 25 that was used for just 3 hectares. He said, forgetting the last syllable of the word he wanted to say. And that's an interestingly stark difference between the relative value that is being assigned to this land by its owner and the relative value that was assigned to the one that was mentioned as having the vineyards in it.
So do we have an explanation for the variability of price here? Is it perhaps that the previous 3 hectares were in a much more, either a more known to be productive land or just in a better position, and perhaps these 50 hectares were somewhere kind of, out in the boonies?
It is... You caught me off guard with boonies there, you evil, evil man. I suspect that there are 2 potential explanations. The first is one that you mentioned, which is it may have been, despite the fact that it possesses vines, less agriculturally productive land, because it's interesting that it mentions that there are 10,000 vines rather than there is a vineyard. On the other hand, I could, in fact, be misinterpreting that, and it actually refers to a much larger amount of vines than the previous, which wouldn't therefore explain the difference. So I'm not quite prepared to commit to it. However, the other explanation that I'm prepared to entertain is that this Bar Hate was maybe a minor landowner that possessed very little social rank, and therefore was able to be essentially poked into selling this land at a much lower value than it would otherwise be worth, because he otherwise possessed no real rank within Assyrian society compared to a royal charioteer. And the reason that I suggest this is because Barhate is not mentioned as possessing any particular profession or rank, which several of the other people who Shuma Ilani had bought things from does mention.
And yet we do have a seal for Barhate.
And yet we do have a seal. My favourite explanation is that Barhate possesses a lesser rank than the seller of the land who sold it for 25 mina, but because the seal does not, in fact, unfortunately tell us what his rank is, and neither is his rank referred to, we do not, in fact, know for the context of this letter whether or not one was more highly ranked than the other. And there are other potential explanations if we really went into the human element that explained for it. They could be old friends and he wanted to sell him the land, but because they were friends, he sold him it at a very, very, very reasonable price for it, and maybe the one who sold it in the land for 25 minas didn't like him very much and therefore extracted every little bit of silver he could. I'm not saying there is any proof in the documents that this is the case, but unfortunately, as much as cuneiform provides this wonderful, rich documentation that many other corpuses cannot provide, there are still many areas in which we cannot properly read the reasons for particular things occurring, and in this case the human element is what is very much missing from a very formal written contract.
So before we get into additional speculation about, Suma Alani winning things in dice games and making good friends, I think now at this point we're going to move away from this royal charioteer that we've spent so much time with, and I think you had some other documents that you wanted to reference.
No, that's a very, very well-timed thing. I didn't really have that much further to say about them, so you've given me quite a good excuse to not talk about those letters anymore. But in all seriousness, there are indeed some more letters that I want to cover before we're finished, because they again provide very particular insights that are almost unheard of for things and events this far back in human history to do with their specificity. The first one that I want to deal with in this sort of final group of letters is one that is titled Features of a Royal Statue Disputed. Now, unfortunately, my very willing interviewer has been provided with many of the letters that I wanted to do in advance, but I haven't provided this one, and just as a reference both for viewers and also for you, this is from the 13th volume of the State Archives, and it is number 034, which is titled Features of a Royal Statue Disputed. And the reason that I picked this letter as one of my final ones is because it's a letter from someone who is very clearly some kind of artist or sculptor asking the Assyrian king what his opinion is on the statue that is being provided. So it begins with the usual, "To the king, my lord, your servant Nabu Ashared, may Ashur and Ashara bless the king," yada yada yada, concerning what the king has asked me. And this is where we get an unusual insight into the process of the kings actually making decisions about all of these statues and inscriptions that we see from all of these different archaeological sites. So, Nabu Ashared says, "We have now sent 2 royal images to the king. I myself sketched the royal image, which is an outline. They fashioned the royal image, which is in the round," which is a phrase meaning it's in the rough kind of maquette stage. "The king should examine them, and whichever the king finds acceptable, we will execute accordingly. Let the king pay attention to the hands, the chin, and the hair." I personally love this letter because it's almost a little bit patronizing of the Assyrian king, to do with now you should pay extra attention to the hair because the hair is especially important in statues, but it's also because it makes reference to the very bureaucratic process of creating royal monuments. To do with, there are sketches for multiple versions of it that the king is being asked to choose between. And indeed, as the letter goes on, there's actually a further elaboration to do with this, where he gets incredibly technical. As for the royal image which they are making, I'm sorry, I'm doing slightly imperious tones here just because I'm trying to get into character. The scepter is lying across his arm, and his arm is resting on his thighs. I myself do not agree with this, and I will not fashion it so. I could speak with them about features, about anything, whatever, but they wouldn't listen to me.
So it sounds like we have a bit of a fussy artist.
Oh, I don't think there's anything but a fussy artist in my own personal experience, and I'm speaking as somebody who used to study art, so that's very much self-deprecation there.
So presumably someone has tried to track down and link the statue being referred to in this document to an actual physical remain. However unlikely. Yeah.
Unfortunately, as much as people can try, they're not going to manage it. This document is fragmentary. I read the most complete extracts, which are also the most relevant extracts. A great deal of the document which is actually damaged or illegible, which means that there would possibly be many particular details available which, alas, we can't read and therefore use to properly identify the statue, especially because when he mentions the scepter is lying across his arm and his arm is resting on his thighs, that doesn't help us identify the statue because the artist is saying he doesn't want to do that statue and he won't make it. So the only distinguishing features about it that are mentioned are the things the artist is saying he refuses to do. And the unfortunate other thing is there are just so many Assyrian statues of various kinds that attempting to make precise relationships between one mentioned in the text and one actually seen in the flesh is almost impossible unless the inscription is mentioned somewhere or the location of the statue is mentioned somewhere. And unfortunately, this is not the case in this particular one.
And was the artist signing this with a seal himself as well, or is this another more fingernail impressions? Presumably this is not a transaction, so we don't need the same amount of witnesses, but how was this signed?
Because this is no longer a transaction and this is a personally addressed letter, the seal, should it have existed, would have gone on the clay envelope that surrounded the letter, whereas the letter itself is personally addressed. It's exactly the difference between what we would consider a contract and a letter. I mean, the only real exception would be we would possibly expect a signature on a handwritten letter as well, or even a typed letter. But aside from that, the same general rules apply of in a contract, it has very particular formal arrangements. And this is a letter in which somebody is trying to talk to somebody long distance. So no, in this particular case, there is no seal and there is no fingerprint. And the clay envelopes I mentioned, unfortunately, they do actually survive for a number of letters, the clay envelopes, because if you think about it, even a clay tablet has some fragility to it, so how would they prevent it being damaged, and how would they keep private letters private? And the answer is, cuneiform documents of sensitive natures would have clay envelopes that would be broken with a hammer, and then the letter inside would be read.
So you would literally seal a clay tablet inside another clay tablet.
In this case, it's sort of like having a little nut made of clay, where you've got the shell and then you've got the tasty clay walnut inside with all the writing inside that you need to get your special tools to extract, or a hard rock. But I suspect that with this.
So what are some of the other documents that we have?
So, there are a couple more that I wanted to deal with before we're done with specific documents. Now, this one was another letter that I picked because it illustrates the very functional relationship of the king to actually having to make decisions and indeed in this case repairs to various statues. So this text, unlike the previous ones that we've been dealing with that are royal letters of some kind or another, is in fact between two people both subordinate to the king of Assyria, one writing to the other, and their relative position to one another is going to be relatively clear from the context of the content, and this letter is small enough that I can read it in its entirety and therefore it will be fairly clear to you. A tablet of Nabu Bestunu to Ashur-Madamik. Good health to you. Give the silver, whether 2 or 3 minas, as much as Akalanu requests of you, to the repair of the seats of Ashur and Melisu. When the work is finished, inspect it together. They should make the delivery to you, and he should receive the shearings in your presence. Take note of his share and record it on your writing board for reference. Which is very abrupt compared to the rather flowery style of a number of the previous letters we've dealt with.
There's very little beard wiping on sandals in this one, yes.
And interestingly, what I wanted to emphasize here is that there is a very elaborate tiering system when it comes to how different people should address one another in these letters relative to their rank. So somebody who the king is writing to, he can write pretty much whatever he wants as his pleasantries. I am well, the king is well, you may be glad. Sometimes the kings of Assyria will get more flowery with their addresses with other kings in their diplomatic correspondence. But aside from that, generally the king can get away with responding to whomever he likes, however he likes. However, people addressing the king, the closer they are to the king, the less ridiculously formal and butt-kissy their various addresses have to be. So some of them are pretty much just, I hope you're well, I hope the gods give you good health. Which is, in terms of these things, relatively straightforward, but some of them are sort of, may the citizens of all the four corners of the earth bow down before you, and may you never have to watch an episode of Scooby-Doo again, and may you get a bike for Christmas because you've been such a good king, haven't you? Type stuff. And in this one, what we're seeing here is the king has taken out the equation entirely, and you're dealing with somebody who is quite clearly superior to the other in the Assyrian bureaucracy and administration, because he simply says, good health to you, which is about as minimalistic a pleasantry as you can get before it just becomes like an acronym.
And so what does this tell us, at least in the content of the letter, about how communication and how... Because, we're really talking about kind of bureaucrats here. They are, I guess, at some point they would hold some sort of connection to the royal house and such, and perhaps be, we might describe them as nobility. But what does this really tell us about who these people were and how they interact with each other on this kind of daily bureaucratic basis?
They are far less polite to one another unless one of them is very superior in these letters. Even the king, when he's being rude, tends to have a little bit more of an explanation in his various letters as to what he's thinking and doing. The exceptions are very funny for it, but they are generally exceptions to it. Whereas even between relative peers in these letters, they are much less guarded about being rude, essentially, to one another. And they are sometimes ordering one another about. Oftentimes it's because one of them is literally superior to the other, but sometimes they aren't superior to one another. In this particular letter, it's very clear that Nabubesunu is a superior to Ashurbanipal and therefore does not feel the need to be flowery. He isn't particularly unpleasant. He still says, good health to you, because we do get letters without any pleasantries of any kind whatsoever. He orders him, but he doesn't actually, let's say, accuse him of being negligent or say you will be whipped if you don't do this in time. And believe me, that is an actual standard to clear in Assyrian letters between various minor officials.
So there was the threat of make sure you do this or I'll have you beaten, essentially. That was a common
there are times in which the king, because a particular official done what he'd been told, threatened them with death should they not complete it. This is not because the Assyrians were particularly execution happy for the standards of the time, but because when the king is really trying to persuade somebody to get off their arse, he will say, you will be blinded, or you will be killed if you do not fulfill this order. Because sometimes, considering the sort of Pony Express form of communication we're relying on here, time for letters to even reach their destination, only for you to find out several weeks later that they've completely ignored what you've told them to do, and there is ever-present threat of people occasionally rebelling or seceding to another state or defecting to another state. So the punishments actually serve a real reinforcement that there is actually some mistrust that comes with delegating responsibility over such great distances. In this case, however, it is actually quite clear that they are not really remonstrating. They're giving them an order, but there isn't any unnecessary sort of, stop being lazy, why haven't you done this already? I'm 10 times the man you are type element to it.
It's just kind of a mundane, everyday inter-office memo, you could say.
However, the last letter on my set list of letters that I have left to do is illustrating the complete opposite to this, which is why I chose this pair. This, again, is a letter that is between people below the king's level. And again, it's a relatively short letter, so I'll read it out in full. Letter of Takisha to Ashur-Sharu-Usur. Have you noticed the thing where Ashur is a very common element of people's personal names? Good health to my brother. And a quick note here, him saying good health to my brother means that they are probably peers and not one is superior to the other, because in these Akkadian documents, referring to someone as your brother almost always refers to them being as an equal in social respects, which is why Bronze Age diplomatic letters between various kingdoms have them referring to one another as brother, even if one of them's Egyptian and the other one is from Babylon. To continue with the letter, however, concerning the offering pipes of Adad and Babu, I have written to the palace. They said the following: the first day of Shabbat is good. Let them break through and set to work. Let them apply themselves and perform the work quickly. End quote. I am now writing to you. Instruct the carpenters about the woods which we selected and make everything clear to them. Let them set to work and do a good job on the first day of Shabbat. Also, for the rest of your work, don't be negligent. Apply yourselves and do a good job. What else? As I have already written to you, don't be negligent.
So we have that repetition of telling them not to be negligent, just kind of driving it home.
It's my favourite element of the whole letter. It's a very recognisable human thing of going beyond the basic grammatical needs of a letter and repeating to somebody who's immediately already read it for emphasis.
So it is kind of talking down to someone as if, perhaps they had a previous experience where they knew that this person was perhaps not the most diligent in their tasks.
A great deal of correspondence in the ancient world that we have access to, be it Assyrian or Persian or from Arabia in some cases, so much of it is, you have not done this. Why have you not done this? Why are you being so lazy? Stop sitting on your bum all day and get on and do it. That is a great deal of our letters between various sub-royal officials in these states, and this one is absolutely no exception. There is almost certainly a history of Ashur-Sharu-Usur not doing everything that he's been told to do, especially because Takisha is probably his peer. He probably has a rivalry between the two of them.
For concluding remarks, I think because we've gone through quite a good bit of letters here, and we talked about the location, where they're found, I think perhaps if we could just kind of close out by talking about what these Assyrian State Archives and what kind of the translation of these cuneiform documents have really kind of given us how have they given us an insight into the Neo-Assyrian period. And particularly how that insight of being actually able to read these documents from about 1860 onward, where we found that kind of Rosetta Stone essentially to help us translate in the Akkadian language and cuneiform, how that period of being able to actually read these very specific and sometimes very personal documents compares to some of the kind of earlier interpretations of the Assyrians that might have come strictly from, say, biblical sources.
So, you've touched on a number of things there, all of which are interesting and a good way to close us out. I agree. So, when it comes to the historiography, because I'll deal with that sort of chronological order, you're absolutely right. And as already mentioned, in that the original interpretations of Assyria primarily came via the Bible because they are so very prominent in it. Almost any people who are significantly mentioned in the Bible tend to have been the first people who were focused on when it came to archaeology and the Bible was also taken as being relatively truthful about things like that. I'm not going to get into the literalism of the Bible here, especially considering different parts of the Bible have actually gotten completely different genres, essentially. But regardless of whether or not you take the Bible literally or not, nonetheless, people would use them as sources for historical interactions with these various peoples, and the Assyrians were no exception. But when these letters were first translated, it opened up the Assyrians' personal world. Rather than having the accounts of people who were at the receiving end of Assyrian aggression, whilst that's actually very interesting in its own right, it means we could start to talk about the Assyrians from their own point of view. We could start to talk about their conceptions of the world, their view on their own empire, the way their monarchy functioned within their, and everything to do with actually looking at Assyria from Assyria's point of view. And I'm very much a proponent of the idea that you should first try and look at any historical culture or state from its own internal point of view first, before you start looking at things externally to that. What initially happened was that Syriology was very popular while still being very... You wouldn't have found very many people in Britain or America or Germany who had heard of the contents of any of these cuneiform documents, and they would generally have relied on on what I would term the pop cultural associations of Assyria with them. But nonetheless, Assyrian monument and the existence of their writing was a huge cultural boom, in the same way that the Egyptians were, in the same way the ancient Greek and Roman artifacts were in earlier periods. And what you ended up with is a very slow change in public perception of the Assyrians, because more of the contents of the tablets became more generally understood and therefore were able to be expressed in books and documentaries as we go into the 20th century. However, pop cultural associations of Assyria are very often still dependent on the biblical interpretation, because that is a very difficult kind of momentum to completely reverse in about 150 years worth of understanding their texts, so that even these days the general impression of Assyria is still very much similar to the one that you get in the Bible, where they're primarily associated with being warlike and of being incredibly cruel. It's not that the Assyrians couldn't be cruel, because that they absolutely could, but it's a combination of the fact that the cruelty of the Assyrians is absolutely the focus of the Old Testament accounts of what they were doing, and they often talked a good game when it came to the horrific things they would do to their enemies, which quite clearly was more to do with emphasizing how strong they were than to do with, in many cases, any real policy, because we're getting now into what the documents tell us that's counter to the biblical impression, is that many, many times the Assyrians were more concerned about diplomacy, and they were more concerned about trying to get new allies, and they would often act in their allies' interests when they were sufficiently threatened by an external force. So that whilst the militarism is not incorrect, it was a large military and a very, very well equipped one, it wasn't the sole focus of their society, and it never was. And their sole focus was never conquest. They had plenty of room for things like diplomacy. Because if you remember, the very first letter I mentioned, King Sargon II of Assyria is ecstatic that a state has become his ally without him having to use military force. It's quite clear that they were very happy to not have to use force when it was not necessary, which is probably also why it took them so long to get rid of the client kingdoms and replace them with Assyrian governors during this period. And to round off what I've been talking about here, to do with what the documents actually tell us that we couldn't otherwise glean, in addition to what I mentioned to do with specific foreign policy and what kings were seeking to do when, which isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea when it comes to history anyway, we can start using these documents to talk about real value of things like land and human labour and costs. We can talk about the size of the logistics of the Assyrian state. We can talk about how they dealt with like the actual business of governing on a local level. We can talk about the kind of resources required for building a house, say. We can talk about things to do with the purchasing power that particular bits of money could give you. It gives completely unbeatable insights into ordinary Assyrian. That is where, if your fancy is not for military and royal affairs, that is where the heart of the cuneiform state archives provide us with unbeatable information. And if you are interested in things like kings and their officials, there is an awful lot of very humanizing elements in these tablets. And that's not by any means saying, therefore, they were great guys, but it does help you see them more as human beings rather than names and dates in a book.
Well, Rory, thank you so much for talking to us on this subject today. I hope we'll actually get to have you back at some point to cover even more topics, because you do have a broad and diverse field of interests, and feel quite, I guess you could say, competent in talking on them. So again, thank you for talking with us about the State Archives of Assyria.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much for all of the buttering up you did for me just then. My ego is feeling not only massaged, it had a happy ending and everything.
And there you go. I hope you've all learned a great deal today and enjoyed my talk I had with Daeres. It was quite informative to me. Like I said, this wasn't a topic I knew a whole lot about, and I think it's a topic that obviously there's only a few hundred people in the world who can speak Akkadian. There's only a few people in the world who actually have this kind of in-depth knowledge that you're getting now. But I think it's also, the ancient Near East is something that really, when we approach history, it's so foreign and so deep in the past that it can sometimes seem almost like not just talking about different cultures, but like a different planet altogether. So it's very interesting to see that scribes or petty officials writing back to each other, telling each other not to be lazy, or a fussy artist saying, "I will not do it this way." So it's very humanizing. At the same time, of course, it deals with high level things like war and peace and all sorts of crazy things like that. As I said in the opener, we will put links to the Assyrian State Archive, or I'll put links to the Assyrian State Archive up in the discussion post and reference which of the actual documents that we were talking about, so you can go and read them in full. Daeres tried to cover, he really did cover the very relevant pieces, so... but there's just some little interesting things, like if you want to go through like I did and see if the witnesses for the various land transactions such ever repeat. Coming up next fortnight, I will be talking with Emberinia about Teens. Specifically, we'll be looking at the kind of early medieval dynasties, the Macedonians and the Komnoi, which are seen as a golden era for the Byzantines, and really they're the height of their power before they started to slide into, basically just controlling Constantinople. It is, as I kind of warned at the intro bit, these are going to be some of our longest episodes. I'm going to keep them as just two-parters, but that does mean they're going to be almost 2 hours each. Like I said, it's very Dan Carlin-esque in length. Because Emberinia had quite a lot to say. This is a very in-depth and very detailed. We have a lot of detailed sources for this period. Well, maybe not a lot. You'll see we rely a lot on Anna Komnoi and the Alexiad, especially in the beginning, but it is something that we have a lot of information about, and is just a very intricate and convoluted, one might even say Byzantine period of history. So we cover that fairly in-depth, and I hope that you should all be able to write graduate level papers on this period when you're done listening to the 2 episodes. But that'll be in 2 weeks. For now, please, as always, if you enjoyed the show, rate and review us on iTunes. If you didn't enjoy the show, don't rate and review us on iTunes. It's not like we're making any money off this, but it does make us feel a lot better when we see our numbers, as they have been kind of creeping up in first day downloads and subsequent downloads and people posting in the discussion posts. It warms the tiny cockles of our heart. I'm not sure what a cockle is, but apparently it can be warmed. And you've warmed it for me by listening and enjoying, so thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.